Good afternoon. My name is Trisha Pione, and I am the project director of New England's Hidden Histories at the Congregational Library and Archives. Welcome to today's virtual program, New England Congregationalists in the American Revolution and Imperial History with Dr. Kate Carté. To begin, I want to acknowledge that the Congregational Library and Archives resides in what is now known as Boston, which is in the place of the Blue Hills, the homeland of the Massachusetts people, whose relationships and connections with the land continue to this day and into the future. For those joining us for the first time, the Congregational Library and Archives is an independent research library. Established in 1853, the CLA's mission is to foster a deeper understanding of the spiritual, intellectual, cultural, and civic dimensions of the congregational story and its ongoing relevance in the 21st century. We do this through free access to a research library of 225,000 books, pamphlets, periodicals, and manuscripts, and our digital archive with more than 100,000 images, mostly drawn from our New England's Hidden Histories project. Throughout the year, we offer educational programs and research fellowships for students, scholars, churches, and anyone interested in Congregationalism's influence on the American story. Please check our website, congregationallibrary.org, to learn more about what we do and for news of forthcoming events. Just also want to tell you briefly about the New England's Hidden Histories project. It's a digital project of the Congregational Library and Archives that digitizes and provides access to early New England congregational church records. This project comprises an online collection of manuscript records from about 1620 to 1850, and it includes not only digitized images of the records themselves, but also many of them have been transcribed. And those are all available on our website, congregationallibrary.org/NEHH. Please allow me to introduce today's speaker. Dr. Kate Carté is a professor of history at Southern Methodist University. She is the author most recently of Religion in the American Revolution and Imperial History, published by the University of North Carolina Press for the Omohundro Institute of Early American History and Culture in 2021. And it won the Albert W. Outler Prize from the American Society of Church History. She is currently studying the role of religion, trust, and partisanship in Revolutionary era Savannah, Georgia. Thank you very much for joining us today, Dr. Carté. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Trisha, and thank you also to Kyle and to Lauren for getting this set up, and thank you to everybody at the Congregational Library for joining me today. So what I'm going to talk about today is the story of religion in the American Revolution, particularly as we see it through the congregational lens, but also through a particular theme, which is the theme of the stories we tell about religion in the American Revolution. And I think that's an important theme because it allows us to think about why religion in the American Revolution is such a persistently important subject to us as a nation, as a country that thinks through the relationship between church and state and the relationship that we have as a nation today to the founding era. So if we think about those stories that we tell, there are kind of two competing narratives that come to mind. The first one is one that I often hear from students, and that's the idea that Puritans fled England for religious freedom, and then they fought for it against King George in the American Revolution. And I'm sure most of the people in our audience today are abundantly aware that there were many generations in between those initial Puritan settlers and the American Revolution in the 18th century. But our students like to collapse that. And I think the reason that not just our students, but also our country likes to collapse it, and we see it most vividly in the Thanksgiving story, which is where this image we have up here on the top left comes from. The reason this really works for us is that it suggests that the people who fought the revolution were particularly unified and religious and earnest and devout in making good choices, so that when they were fighting for freedom, when they were disrupting their political ties to England, they were doing it for thoughtful and legitimate reasons. So that story is very, very important to us, and you can see that in this lower image we have here also, which is an image I'll talk about a little bit later, which is of Jacob Duché preaching at the First General Conference. This idea of unified leadership doing something prayerfully and right. The other narrative we have about religion in the American Revolution runs in a completely different direction. And that's the narrative of disestablishment, of the separation of church and state, that people who fought devoutly for freedom of religion. And that's a complicated circle to square. It's a complicated, those are two stories that's difficult to pull together, because one of them is about religious unity, and people who have a lot of religious unity don't need a lot of religious freedom. And then on the other hand, there's a story about religious liberty and about respecting religious difference. So what I'd like to do today is talk a bit about how we get from point A to point B, how we get from religious unity kind of at the beginning of the revolution to religious disestablishment at the end of the revolution, and think about the stories that we can pull together there. So the place this story starts is with what I call British Imperial Protestantism. And this requires us to go back a little bit into the colonial period and think about how in Britain's 17th and 18th century history, the British Empire built a system of shared religious practice. And, I really love this, this image here. This is actually, I think, it's at a museum in Boston. I'm forgetting exactly which one. It's an image I found. It's painted on wood. And I found it in a book by Doug Winiarski, which I'm sure many of you have read, about the Great Awakening in New England, a truly fantastic book. And what I love about this particular image is it really kind of embodies that idea of British Imperial Protestantism. So on the right side of the picture, we have this group of what were undoubtedly New England Congregationalists, right? So a group of ministers, we don't know exactly who they were, but they're sitting around a table, and presumably they're studying together, they've got books. And from what we know about religion in New England in the 18th century, those men probably disagreed with each other. They probably disagreed on questions of theology. Some of them, like many New England Congregationalists at the time, were probably moving in a Unitarian direction. Some of them had probably been animated by the Great Awakening and the Whitfieldian movements that swept through New England in the mid 18th century. And those people who would become what we think of as evangelicals, they differed theologically on a great number of questions from their fellows. There's also probably some people in there who differ on church governance. There may even be an Anglican in there. There were certainly Anglicans in 18th century Massachusetts. But they all look alike. And that's really what comes together at the end of the day. These guys, although they disagree about a lot of issues, they're sitting around the table and they're wearing the same clothes. They're able to come together and agree about what they're going to argue about. And presumably they're able to keep away from that table anything they think of as really disruptive to religion. On the other side of the picture, we have this sort of grand landscape, right? You can easily imagine a kind of manifest destiny sort of landscape there, that these religious leaders are overseeing this kind of providential landscape, right? And that idea of mastering space and coming together and creating unity through diversity is really at the heart of British Imperial Protestantism. This idea that the state and religious institutions can bring acceptable diversity together to create political unity. And that's what I think of as British Imperial Protestantism. So the origins of this come in the end of the 17th century with the Glorious Revolution in Britain. And that's the moment, for those of you who are not up on your 17th century British history, which is, of course, to be expected. After the Civil War in Britain, the war in which the Puritans and the Royalists fought, the British Parliament invited in the Protestant King William and his wife Mary. Mary was the daughter of the outgoing king. They did this because the outgoing king, James II, was a Catholic, and the Parliament decided that a Protestant nation could not be ruled by a popish prince, so you could not have a Catholic monarch. So they invite in William and Mary, and William and Mary are coming into a country that has endured decades of religious warfare, and also a country that's divided in many ways because of the way they come in. They're the rulers of both England and Scotland, but Scotland has a Presbyterian church. England has an Anglican church with bishops, and there's a lot of religious diversity, Protestant religious diversity within England. So they move towards a political settlement that will allow them to build what they consider a Protestant empire. Protestant doesn't really mean anything other than not Catholic, right? So Protestant really the term comes from the protesting German princes at the Diet of Speyer in I think 1539 or something. It just means protesting. It doesn't mean anything specific. But when they create a Protestant identity, they give it a specific meaning. It's a political meaning, and it's a coming together of loyal Protestants who they agree they're not Catholic, they agree they're not subject to the Pope, and they agree on a series of theological principles and allow diversity in very specific ways. And they agree to follow William and Mary. So there's an established Church of Scotland that's Presbyterian, an established Church of England that's Anglican, Episcopalian. And then there is, through something called the Act of Toleration, and here's where we get our Congregationalists coming in, there is official toleration, official acceptance of non-Anglicans in England, Protestants, Baptists, Congregationalists, Baptists, and Presbyterians who are loyal to the crown. They have to exist under certain restrictions. If they meet, they have to meet in a public meeting space, and they can't close the door. You can't have dissenting religion in private, because that might be dangerous to the state. You could plot something there. You could plot another civil war in there. So you have to keep your doors open. But provided they do those loyal things, they are welcome to meet and be who they want to be. So this gives us the structure of Imperial Protestantism, this political framework that allows for religious diversity that's acceptable. This comes to be called the Constitution in Church and State, and it has the monarch at its head. The monarch is the spiritual and political embodiment of that. And here we have an image of George III's coronation in 1760. Happens in Westminster Abbey. It's a religious event. There's a religious ceremony around it, and he swears to uphold the Constitution in Church and State. So the British think of their Constitution, and especially they think of the joining of England and Scotland, as a religious event that creates Protestantism. So that's what the religious unity of the empire is as we're going into the 18th century. So what does this mean for the colonies? This happens in the colonies, again, as I said, at the beginning of the 18th century, but the colonies already had a whole series of different political and religious arrangements in mind, or in practice. Many of those colonies, including, of course, the New England colonies, had been founded before the Glorious Revolution, and they had their own arrangements for church and state in place. They have the standing order, right, the Congregationalist establishment, and then most of the southern colonies have an Anglican establishment, the Church of England. So do the Caribbean colonies. And then we have these kind of wacky exceptions of Pennsylvania and New York, which has the issues with having been taken over from the Dutch, and Rhode Island. So we have this sort of hodgepodge coming in to the 18th century. The system that's been created from the center after the Glorious Revolution then spreads out and grows to encompass and surround the rest of the empire. And it does that through a very sort of specific process where different colonial spaces kind of test, can they do what they're going to do? And then they get pushed into a common form. So what does that actually look like? In New England, and I think the New England Congregationalists are really kind of at the heart of this story, New England has the strongest non-Anglican establishment in the colonies. So whereas the Church of England in England, they just ignore Scotland, right? Scotland is Presbyterian. Okay, we're going to ignore that. But the Church of England wants to claim to be the empire for the colonies. The main thing that's stopping them from doing that is the establishment of the Congregationalists in New England and Connecticut, and to some extent in New Hampshire. So it's that restriction that's keeping them from doing it. So legal authorities in England, from the Church of England, push to start creating a bishop in the colonies, and also to change the establishment in Massachusetts. It goes before the Attorney General in Britain, and he rules no, that should not happen. That the charters in New England guarantee their own religious establishments, and that they do not have to conform to the Church of England. This is really monumental. We often remember this actually from the other end, which is that after the Glorious Revolution, King's Chapel in Boston is formalized. They can know they have to. The Bostonians, the Massachusetts have to accept members of the Church of England. But the flip side of that is actually much more important. They were not deprived of their establishment. And it's the presence of the Congregational establishment in New England that forces the British Empire from this kind of Britain-centered two-part establishment into an empire-wide three-part establishment. So we have Congregationalists established in New England, we have Presbyterians established in Scotland, and we have Anglicans established in England. They build then a whole lot of political policies around protecting and supporting Protestants and allowing those Protestants to move all over that system. If you are a loyal Protestant, and this gets tested in a bunch of court cases, if you are a loyal Protestant, you can move anywhere in that empire. So even though there is an established church, an established Anglican church in Virginia, for instance, Presbyterians can move there and can practice freely. Members of the Dutch Reformed Church can move around and can practice freely. Now, they have restrictions on other rights. They're not necessarily always able to marry and do other, their ministers aren't granted full privileges necessarily, but they are legally free of persecution. So that creates this kind of imperial-wide system of sort of Protestant unity. So how does this function in practice, this mixed Protestant establishment? Well, within this system, there's a huge amount of mobility and there's a huge amount of immigration. And so people kind of get all mixed up, and religious groups work to maintain connections with one another through all of this mixing. So they build all kinds of connections and networks across the system. A good example of this is this guy, Samuel Davies. So he's from Pennsylvania. He's a Presbyterian. He goes down to Virginia, and he becomes a part of the Awakening movement there. He's actually part of the Awakening movement even before he gets there. He gets invited down to lead an awakened congregation down there. He's invited down because he's been ordained by the Philadelphia Presbyterians. And the Philadelphia Presbyterians, because they have strong ties to the Church of Scotland, are a legitimate Protestant body. They're not schismatic. They're not a problem. They're just Presbyterians, and they're established in Scotland. So he goes down to Virginia. In Virginia, he's able to promote awakened religion, but he also runs into some trouble with the Anglican authorities, who aren't so thrilled about what he's doing. When he does that, he writes back to his fellows, both in Pennsylvania and also in England, because he's connected through these social networks back to England. He writes to England, his Presbyterian and Congregationalist friends in England. It's actually Congregationalist who's the most important node here. He gets in touch with the Bishop of London, and he's off doing their London thing, saying there's this squabble going on in Virginia, and we don't want that squabble going on. How are we going to solve it? And they kind of write back and forth in London about what exactly are the terms of the Act of Toleration, and exactly what should Presbyterians be allowed to do in Virginia. And they come to a conclusion, and it ends up going before the Privy Council, and the Privy Council writes to Virginia and says, you can't persecute Presbyterians who are not doing anything particularly wrong because it's bad for commerce. So this system sort of circles around the Atlantic and pushes people in various parts of the colonies to accept each other and provide this kind of religious freedom, even when it's not necessarily in the interest of religious leaders. So religious leaders might be quite annoyed at one another for taking each other's territory or doing whatever kind of shenanigans people are up to. Larger political forces are going to keep them from using religious persecution. They doesn't stop them from persecuting people for just straight up bad behavior, but that's a civil crime, not a religious crime, right? So another way that this pulls people together that gets very important as we get towards the American Revolution is that because they're participating in this shared political Protestantism, they also participate in the political side of that. They don't just enjoy the benefits of toleration, they also support the state. So they get very deeply invested in the goals of the British Empire. And the goals of the British Empire, as far as they're concerned, are protecting Protestantism from the French and the Spanish. That's very important. And they're doing that militarily all the time. And it's also spreading Christianity, spreading specifically Protestant Christianity to indigenous people and enslaved people. So you see clergy from all of these different communities including people who are dissenters, right? So Congregationalists, Presbyterians, and Baptists, people who are not a part of the Church of England, all across the empire buying into the imperial goals, even though they are not the official church of the empire. But as you can imagine, there are problems with this system. So we've created a kind of political religion. How far can you push political religion? Where does political religion go when it faces challenges from one direction or another? So the problem with Protestantism is that it assumes a level of political unity when that political unity might not really be there. So on the one hand, I don't want to underplay the frustrations and the disagreements between various religious groups. In New England, you had intense competition between Congregationalists and Anglicans. Anglicans who were aggressively trying to, especially as we get close to the Revolution, they're aggressively trying to promote what they see as imperial religion. They're trying to build new missions. It's not clear that those missions are always going to be to people who are unchurched, who have no access to clergy. They sometimes seem to be poaching congregations, members of congregations that are already sort of established, legally established, and they're not supposed to do that. Sort of by gentleman's agreement, I guess. And so you see a kind of assumed official unity that covers over pretty intense underlying conflicts that were theological, that were ecclesiastical, in other words, about the differences in opinions about church governance, and also differences that were political, real differences about political issues, including the kinds of issues that were leading into the Revolution. In the colonies, especially, this sort of scaffolding of imperial Protestantism depended, and the sort of religious toleration that it promoted, it depended on imperial guardrails. It depended on exactly what Davies did in that case where he was running into political opposition and he wrote back to Britain. It depended on higher up structures coming in and saying that level of religious diversity or conflict is okay, that isn't. Stop it over here. Okay, we'll allow this kind of diversity over here. It depended on those imperial guardrails. But what's going to happen with the American Revolution? The American Revolution, those guardrails are going to disappear. So this system works until about the mid-1770s, until the time that the American Revolution breaks out. As the war started and as political support for it mounted, leaders of the revolution sought support for sought the support of religious leaders. And to do that, they tried to make use of the same rituals that had been used to bind the state together before. But when they did that, they start to pull the system of imperial Protestantism apart. Because while most Americans eventually, especially most New Englanders, will follow the American cause, many did not. And so in pulling the sort of structures of Protestantism towards this rebelling body, that larger imperial system has to collapse. There's a couple ways we can think about this, a couple stories. The first one is to go back to that initial picture that we had. So this is Jacob Duché. Jacob Duché is one of my favorite people from history because, honestly, because he was just a really nice guy. Even people who got very, very frustrated with him always gave him the benefit of the doubt. He was cheerful and friendly and willing to support the cause that seemed right at the moment. So the story behind this particular picture, and this picture is a 19th century etching from a painting that was done by a guy named Matheson, and it's actually in stained glass in Philadelphia. So this is a picture that depicts a moment from the First General Conference. And according to John Adams, who wrote back about what happened there, they were getting ready to meet and discuss the events of the day. This is their first session in 1774, and just after the Coercive Acts, and they and somebody proposes that they need to have a prayer to start the meeting, and right away people within the body get afraid and say, no, religion could really divide us, because again, they've lost those kind of imperial structures. They don't know what's okay and what's not okay, so we shouldn't touch religion. And then Samuel Adams says, from Massachusetts, Samuel Adams says, I can listen to any preacher as long as he's a patriot. And I think that's a really interesting moment because he's putting political qualifications on his religion. Good religion for him means it supports the American cause at this revolutionary moment when that's not necessarily the just cause, at least not legally. So he says he'll support anyone. And somebody else says, well, there's this nice guy down the street in Philadelphia. He's an Anglican, member of the Church of England, but he's a nice guy. So he comes in, Jacob Duchesne, he preaches. And apparently he preached so movingly that everybody fell into just sort of deep and extended prayer. And John Adams writes to Abigail and says it was better than any sermon he'd even heard Dr. Cooper preach in Boston. So apparently it was very, very moving. So this is this moment that's been memorialized for Americans, I think, especially because it suggests that the people who, as I said at the beginning, the people who fought the revolution, the people who took those initial steps into war with Britain did so prayerfully and thoughtfully. So that's the image we get. But then Jacob Duchesne's story goes on. So Jacob Duchesne, he's an Anglican in Philadelphia. He's there during the time that Philadelphia is taken over by the Bostonian or by the British Army. He had been chaplain to the Continental Congress, and so he's imprisoned for a few days. And by that point, he's seeing just real hardship in the United States because of the war. And he decides that he really doesn't think that the American Revolution can succeed. And he thinks that the Declaration of Independence was probably a mistake because it committed the United States to that course of independence, and that independence was just too far. So he decides he needs to act, and he knows Washington socially. They'd been in Philadelphia together at various points, and they're both Anglicans, and so they had some social connections there. And so he writes a letter to Washington, who's out at Valley Forge, and he says, you really need to end this war. And it's essentially the image that always comes to mind is John Kerry saying, how can you ask someone to be the last person to die for a mistake in war? I know I'm misquoting that, but that sort of sentiment. His point, he's a very loyal American. His grandfather was mayor of Philadelphia. His father was mayor of Philadelphia. He's very committed to being an American, but he does not think that Americans can withstand the suffering that's coming. And so he needs the war to stop. And he thinks Washington can do it. Washington gets this letter and he drops it like a hot potato. It looks like treason. He says, I want no part of this, and he hands it over to Congress. And Congress drives Duchesne out. He ends up being a pastor in Lambeth in England for the rest of the war. He does eventually make it back to the United States in the 1790s. And actually, by the end of the war, he becomes a Swedenborgian, and he writes these kind of plaintive letters about how religion ought to bind all people together, and that revolutions, and at that point, this is after the French Revolution also, that revolutions do nothing but drive people apart, and that revolutions are wrong, but not in a sort of monarchist way, more in a kind of pacifist way almost. So he spins off in that direction. He's this icon of American religious nationalism for many people, but that's not where he went in the long run. And it really kind of pushes us to think about how difficult the war was and how many times people had to make choices that pulled them away from kind of quick political judgments or from ways that they had been attached before the war in terms of religion. The other story that I think here's his letter in 1777. The other story I think that is really important here is one of Benedict Arnold. Is the story of Benedict Arnold. And I have to give credit to one of my students here. I had never known that Benedict Arnold used religion to support his case until one of my students dug it up in a newspaper a few years ago. Benedict Arnold, of course, great traitor to the American cause, hero of Saratoga, who then changes sides. When his treachery comes out, he claims, he writes a letter to the public, and he claims that he did it because when the Americans joined sides with the French, they betrayed their Protestantism. Now, Benedict Arnold was not a particularly ethical guy, so I don't know that we need to necessarily take him at face value there, but it does point to the idea that there was this sort of powerful rhetoric of Protestantism that was lingering in the environment even during the war, and putting people in a difficult position as they moved away from this sort of investment in shared Protestantism into something else. Another thing that comes to mind here, another moment that comes to mind is a great letter that I saw in the Congregational Library's collection, in that beautiful exhibit that folks put together online. A letter from 1779 decrying a minister for being too sympathetic to the Catholics, or to the presumably then French Catholics, too sympathetic to the people who had come to fight with the United States. That's, a lot of Americans were skeptical that violating the boundaries between Protestantism and Catholicism were a good idea, even if it was necessary to win the war. So we see these kind of ruptures in the Protestant system, and we see a lot of sort of intense dislocation during the war. And that's going to force Americans in the new United States to really kind of pick up the pieces, to really sort of try to create a new religious settlement, because what they had really kind of fallen apart. So then it comes time to sort of pick up the pieces. And what does that actually look like? Ideologically, we see the first inklings of this with John Witherspoon's Dominion of Protestant over the passion. Dominions of Providence over the Passions of Men, which he preached right about the same time as the Declaration of Independence. And of course, he was in the Congress, and so he's the only clergyman to sign the Declaration of Independence. He's in the Congress, and he's building a kind of religious argument for the United States at the same time that the Congress is moving towards independence. And what it does is offer a new kind of biblical narrative for the United States. Instead of being part of a shared Protestant empire that protects liberty through its Protestantism, right, which is always, of course, juxtaposed to Catholicism. It's not so much about Christianity as it is about Protestantism versus Catholicism. Witherspoon offers a narrative of biblical unity. He sees the origins for the United States in biblical stories, and he dispenses with the sort of frustrations between the Protestants and the Catholics, and seeks to create an entirely new religious narrative for the new nation. That works really well in rhetoric, doesn't work very well in practice, and that becomes clear immediately afterwards as people are starting to write the Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation is our first government, right? It's our first attempt to clarify what binds the United States together. Usually we discuss the failures of the Articles of Confederation structurally in terms of taxation and its requirements that everybody work in a unified fashion to do whatever they plan to do. But there are some really interesting things that come out of this particular document. It says basically nothing about religion. The British Empire had been unified by a religious settlement, by a constitution in church and state. The early days of the United States, as incarnated in the Continental Congress, actively and intentionally used public religion to pull people together. When it comes to drafting the Articles of Confederation, they stop. They do not invoke that. The closest we get to that is this document here, which you'll see is kind of a mess and scribbled all over. John Dickinson, who was a member of the drafting committee for the Articles of Confederation, he proposed an article early on that would guarantee religious freedom. And in that article, he also tried to deal with the heritage of religious diversity in the colonies. So he has this complicated, convoluted language where he says, okay, you can keep the laws you had before, but you can't pass any new ones, but we're going to protect any kind of religious diversity, but, right? Has no idea how to pull together the diverse religious establishments, from the Standing Order in New England to the Presbyterian majority without much official religion in the Middle Colonies, to the Church of England, which is rapidly collapsing in the South. He doesn't know how to pull that together. He doesn't know what to do with it. The most lasting or the most interesting thing about this maybe is that this is actually the first such statement that uses gender neutral language, explicitly uses gender neutral language. But none of his efforts to get religion into the Articles of Confederation succeed. We don't know exactly what happened in committee, but we know it didn't come out of committee. So the Articles of Confederation, as they are finally released, as they are finally this is the piece that gets in there, as they are finally adopted. The only place where religion comes up is that the states say they will stand together if they are facing attacks on account of religion. But that it doesn't say what that means. What does an attack on account of religion mean? Does it mean a Protestant-Catholic thing? Does it mean something else? Is it an internal religious? We don't know, right? So they know religion is something you can fight over, but they don't know how to create any kind of religious unity at that stage. So it pushes religious disestablishment really down into the state level. At the state level, they have a variety of different agendas across all the different states. They try lots of different things. In many states, you have efforts to codify religious freedom in some sort of extravagant way, but you also have efforts to protect some kind of Protestant establishment. Of course, New England does this the most effectively by really just not disestablishing the earlier versions of their churches and sort of maintaining that they have freedom of religion, although they also have an establishment. When it comes to the First Amendment, actually, New Englanders insist that there's nothing about what goes on in New England that qualifies as an establishment. They just kind of disagree about what establishment means. So they have this sort of scattershot approach. They do have some shared across the states. They do have some shared assumptions. The first, and I think this is really important, is that religion could not threaten the state. So whatever you can do with religion, whatever freedom you claim, you cannot use that freedom to attack the state, right? So just to give the most obvious present day example, the January 6th folks could not say that they were inspired by religion to attack the Capitol. That's not a legitimate, they were not pardoned on those grounds, right? That it was, religion doesn't work as a defense against crime. The second one is that religion could not change civil status. And this is actually really important, but we always forget it, I think. Changing your religious status could not free you from slavery. That had been put into law in the southern states in the 17th century, and it remains true across the British Empire. Becoming a Christian does not give you civil status. That also makes religion very kind of weak. Right? It can't be used to threaten the state, and it can't be used to change civil status. So whatever religion they're protecting is a very kind of minimal, maybe an act of thought. It might be a very important act of thought, but it's not supposed to have radical consequences for your neighbors or for the state. This leaves lots of questions unanswered at each state level. It leaves open the questions of what happens to religious property. Some states actually ban religious organizations owning any property, others don't. It also leaves unanswered questions of a mixed establishment, which is what they had in Britain, where there are actually 2 established state churches, versus disestablishment. No public funds going to any church, right? It doesn't answer that question. And it also really does not answer the question of what is a religion, what qualifies as a religion. It leaves all of those things unanswered. The one thing, and this exists in the Massachusetts Constitution, and I believe is still in the Massachusetts Constitution, the one thing that that remains is this agreement that religious freedom is limited by the responsibility of one to demean themselves peacefully. So each person who has religious freedom enjoys that religious freedom only insofar as they demean themselves peaceably. So before we even get to the First Amendment, we've seen a real collapse of those guardrails, and what goes in place of those international or those imperial guardrails when it comes to religion are these kind of general ideas that religious freedom should be there, but it's religious freedom in a very kind of vague and limited sort of concept. But that part of religion, of public religion, that had been really important as a unifying factor for the United States had kind of not been addressed. And it is not addressed in the Constitution either. The Constitution, even before the First Amendment, does not give any kind of public place for religion. It doesn't mention religion except insofar as it bans religious tests for federal office. So symbolic religion in the United States comes in through a different route. And here we see it coming in really through the voluntary actions of individuals. So religion becomes public religion becomes a private act on behalf of citizens or on behalf of leaders. The most symbolic moment here is Washington's first inauguration. Here we see Washington's hand on the Bible. I heard Trump did not. I'm in Vienna, so I didn't watch the inauguration yesterday, but I heard Trump on Tuesday or Monday, I guess. So I heard Trump didn't put his hand on the Bible. But you can see from this image, this early 19th century image, the fact that Washington swore his oath on the Bible, which is not required by the Constitution. The fact that he did that and says, "So help me God," that becomes very important. So he is voluntarily bringing this in. Even though he had some trepidation about doing it because it sounded a little bit too much like the oath of office that a monarch would take. But you can see from this image that places the Bible right center, even though the Bible was a kind of secondary or accidental part of Washington's inauguration, it becomes very symbolically important. And then, of course, Washington uses lots of religious language in his first inaugural. He uses religious language in his farewell address. He brings that into the conversation rather than it being required by the structures of government. Early presidents also use days of feast and Thanksgiving. It's a long tradition. It's a New England tradition. It's a British tradition. The federal government brings that up as well, but they do it in a very limited fashion. This is the proclamation for the first day of Thanksgiving, the end of the first Congress. Members of Congress, I think it's actually Stockton from New Jersey, says, "Well, we have to have a day of Thanksgiving. We've had our first successful Congress." Washington is unsure he should do that, again, because he thinks it looks too royal. So the proclamation lays out that Congress has asked him to do this. In other words, he has not taken on that authority as a principal, or as a president or as a king. He has rather assented to the people's branch in putting in that action. So symbolic religion in the United States has to move to another place because disestablished religion doesn't offer that symbolic religion at all. This leaves the United States, and when we think of the American Revolution and the origins of disestablishment, we see the war as a break between this moment of sort of contrived unity that descends to the revolutionary forces from the British system, the wartime break in that, and then we see this functional disestablishment that leaves the United States with a very divided character. From the beginning, there are a lot of Americans who want the United States to be represented as a Christian nation, who believe the United States is a Christian nation. People from John Witherspoon all the way up, there's a lot of New England voices in this, people who believe that an official church is essential for the morality of the republic, especially after we get to about 1810 or 1815. You see a lot of language about this from John Adams again. And on the other hand, we see a lot of people who are devoted to a very unsure disestablishment, to a chaotic disestablishment, which I think is really our true heritage of the American Revolution when it comes to religion. It's not one or the other. It's not disestablishment. It's not religious unity. It's the disjuncture between the two of them that is truly our heritage there. So thank you all for listening for such a very long time, and I'd be happy to take any questions that folks have.
Wonderful, thank you very much. We've got some great questions already in the Q&A. I'm going to give everybody a minute to type some more in while I do a shameless plug for our digital exhibition, Religion of Revolution, Congregational Voices on Liberty. If you want to learn more about Congregationalists in New England during the period of the American Revolution, our digital exhibition, which you can find on our website, congregationallibrary.org, explores the ways that Congregationalists in New England were interpreting and debating these new-ish ideas about liberty. And really, I think, is speaking to what Kate, you were talking about with this idea of, how are people making choices about religion in a long and difficult war? So please check out our digital exhibition and take a look at some of the artifacts, including the letter. It's Reverend Timothy Harrington, a letter of complaint against him by 3 members of his church for his friendship with Catholics. Catholics. Very scandalous. And he also said that he thought the Quebec bill was not that bad, like it was fine. And I think we have a question about the Quebec Act. I'll get to that in a second. Let's see, let's start with question from Susan, who's asked, she writes, in my small town congregational church founded in the late 1700s, the first minister was a conscientious objector during the Revolution. He was also well loved and had a 30-year tenure. Was this weird or common? She asks, how was he able to not take a side?
So I'm really curious about how he was a conscientious objector. And what I mean by that is that exactly how he avoided military. So military service was usually not mandatory. There's militia service, but especially in New England after the end of the occupation of Boston, that's going to sort of filter off. So he wouldn't have been required to join the Continental Forces. If we're thinking about service as a chaplain, most of the people who served as chaplains were either Congregationalists or Presbyterians, overwhelmingly Congregationalists and Presbyterians, a few Anglicans though. And they all signed up voluntarily. So, excuse me, I'm wondering whether I'm very curious about the process, right? So I'm wondering if he avoided choosing sides by maneuvering the local challenges to the war, which a lot of people did, and clergy were kind of particularly positioned to, because part of their job is to smooth over difficulties. So you might be able to say, I'm not sure we should be involved in that action, but sure, yes, the established government is fine, whatever that established government is, right? So you could avoid being too partisan one side or the other, unless if your congregation didn't force you into strict form. So I wonder if it was something like that, or if he was forced to take a side and somehow managed to convince folks he didn't want to. And that would be a good question too. All of those scenarios happened. The most dramatic scenarios in New England are places where Anglicans declare that they cannot, because of their religious oaths, they cannot swear allegiance to the United States. They can't pass any of the tests that are being put in place, and a lot of them get driven out. Literally. I mean, you can't get ridden out on a rail before the rails are invented, but literally driven out of town, or their families driven out of town, or so those you do see ministers put to the test, and people saying either you side with us or you don't, and if you don't, you have to leave. That happens all up and down the colonies, and especially in New England. So if he truly was a conscientious objector, how he convinced people that he should be allowed to stay in that position would be fascinating.
Thanks. Question here about after the Revolution. So did the years after the Revolution see less animosity between Protestants and Catholics?
Very briefly, sort of the heyday of Protestant-Catholic relations in the United States. Catholics served disproportionately in the American forces, and so do Jews, by the way. Both Catholics and Jews use their military service as a way to gain citizenship rights, very much like African Americans during several military conflicts. They use that military service to say they have done as much as anyone can for the cause of the United States, and therefore they should have full voting rights. They should have, whatever specific prohibitions are against them lifted. The prohibitions against Catholics are lifted that all the colonies had before the war, even places like Rhode Island and Pennsylvania. Those are lifted pretty much universally. The ones on Jews last a little bit longer. You'll have test oaths that say you have to be a Christian who believes in both the Old and New Testament. And that allows both Protestants and Catholics in, and kind of allows in Unitarians, but keeps Jews out. So you see that kind of opening up. Then once you get, we associate it with Irish immigration, but the real turning point is the Louisiana Purchase. So the bringing in huge quantities of land with large numbers of white and non-white Catholics on it through the Louisiana Purchase freaks out a lot of Americans, and that sort of starts building up the anti-Catholicism again.
Question about women. Did women play a role in these ideas and these events in the revolution? What's happening with women in religion in the American Revolution?
I love that question. So at the beginning, you said I'm now working on political allegiance in Savannah and partisanship. The reason I'm doing this is because there was only one woman in my last project, which this talk comes from. She was a countess, so she's in my new project too. But women were almost entirely excluded from these formal religious organizations. So they would have been in congregations, but their voices were not captured. So women's religious participation, women's political participation is overwhelmingly local. So when you're looking at political and especially transatlantic or national issues, the women's voices become very hard to trace unless they're people like my countess or Abigail Adams or someone like that who has a very special kind of platform. But they're very involved locally. They have, obviously tons of as many opinions as women have today, as all people have, and they're as active. At the local level, what I'm hoping to find is women helping people to make choices about things like sustaining congregations through the war. How do you, as I'm sure you know, and as you have in your collections there, many of these congregations are disrupted by the war as people flee, church books are lost. Who saves the church books? Who is hosting, hosting a dinner, cooking for someone who's suffered and doing it because they are members of a congregation together. I think it's, we know women are disproportionately active in religious charity. So we have to look at the local level.
Look forward to your next book too. Question from Charlie Hambrick Stowe, who asks a question about the National Cathedral in Washington, D.C. So again, we're tying this in a little bit with some current events, but Charlie asks, says there's been 2 national religious events recently at the National Cathedral, state funeral Jimmy Carter and the inaugural prayer service, which was yesterday, saw some clips from that online. And so he asked, would you say that the role the National Cathedral plays in the political life of the United States is an odd survival or a reassertion of pre-revolutionary imperial Protestantism? And then, but with pluralistic adjustments. And if so, how does Bishop Budd's admonition fit into this framework? So that did you see that, Kate? And I know you're not in the US right now. So a bishop of the Episcopal Church, Reverend, I can't think of the first name, Budd, admonished Trump at the inaugural prayer service, asked him to be merciful. So asking if you haven't,
that's really interesting, right? Because the real challenge of a state religion is that it basically doesn't critique the state. It might come at a policy sideways and say we don't love this or we question this a little bit, but head-on critique doesn't usually come from established religion. So which kind of I think gets to the not just the pluralistic, but the kind of different meaning of the National Cathedral today. I would say it's not so much a holdover as it's a reinvention, right? So in the early Republic, there's a lot of efforts, especially from New Englanders, to invent a religious narrative for the United States. And those early, Jedediah Morse explicitly says he's going to write a providential history. And many of the statements we have about religion and the revolution that we get from John Adams come from that correspondence between him and Jedediah Morse, where Morse says, no, I want more religion. And Adams is like, that really wasn't religious. And Morse, no, I need more religion, right? So that when we're getting into 1815, 1820, you get a lot more of that. And I think the National Cathedral, and then of course the Civil War, you have the Confederacy explicitly saying that it's religious, and people in the United States coming back and saying, oh no, us too, although the United States never passes an amendment to that effect. So I think in the 19th century, you have this effort to create that national religious voice, but it never has the kind of gravitas, because it can't ever have the close connection to officialdom that it has an implied connection to officialdom, but it can never have the really close connection to officialdom that had been in the 18th century. So, but that might leave it space for speaking truth to power, right? And when we think about, someone like Martin Luther King, who we treat as a national preacher, right? We treat him as a moral voice for the entire United States. If he had been Archbishop of Washington, right, in some official church, it's likely we wouldn't have had that kind of message from that position.
Interesting. Thank you. Let's see, I think we've got time for one or two more questions, but I want to add an interesting note that Bruce put in the Q&A. He notes that John Paul Jones requested and Washington agreed to ask for Catholic priests to be chaplains in the Continental Navy after France joined.
Yeah, and
that's quite interesting.
And I think the first official chaplain to the United States Army was a Catholic. And Washington was totally fine with that all the way through. Washington said he did not care if there were Catholics in the Army. He was completely fine. He wanted able-bodied people. He hesitated a bit on African Americans, but he was very, very sure that Catholics could fight. And Jews also, right? Jews had been denied the right to do political service or to do military service in Europe for centuries, which is one of the reasons why there's a stereotype that Jews aren't good at military service, and Jews were able to join up too. So yeah, there's the Army as an institution has often been at the forefront of this. And actually, there's some debate about this among historians of religion now, but for a long time, the idea of tri-faith America, of Judeo-Christian tri-faith America, was rooted in the institution of the chaplaincy.
Interesting. Okay, one more question. I think we've got time for one more question. I'm going to sneak it in. Question from Richard Bowles. Were there legislative actions by the early Congresses under the Articles or under the Constitution that you think sought to answer the unresolved question of religion in American public life?
I don't think, nothing that comes to mind. They really do not legislate in terms of trying to create a national religion. So you get things like the National Days of Fast and Thanksgiving, and I think those matter. And then when we look for, David Seahot is great on this, looking for elements of establishment. So you get the alliance between Quaker missionaries and the federal government in terms of missionary work and things like that. So you get alliances between church and state, because the federal state certainly doesn't consider religious bodies to be illegitimate actors. That's a later legal development, right? But I don't think they're doing it symbolically. They're not reaching to religion for the symbolic unification. You can look at all the ways that the nation does try to build a shared national culture, a national, symbols of national unity, what goes on the national seal and all those kinds of things as a way to sort of address some of that.
Thank you. Yeah, I think this is such a vast topic.
Yes.
And this is a really helpful way to frame sort of the introduction to what we're trying to unpack at the Congregational Library over the next few years with our programming on the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution and the role of Congregationalists in it. The background of, and then what is happening in the rest of the colonies and then in the rest of the nation, and how is New England still a little bit weird during that period, right, with this backdrop. Thank you very much to Dr. Kate Carté today, and thank you to all of you for joining us.
Thank you so much.